Thank you guys. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
I'm getting over a cold, so I'll try to speak up as much as I can. First of all, this is super trippy to be in this room. As some of you know, my family's been in and around Steamboat since 1982. Last time I was in this room I was 16 years old. So I'm having flashbacks right now. Just by way of introduction, I live on the Front Range now. I have a very long title. Apologies to everybody who had to read through that on the advertisement. But in essence, I am the head of archives at the University of Colorado Boulder. I've been there since 2018. My family and I now live up in the mountains outside of Boulder and near Netherlands. And so it is super, super cool to be here to be able to talk to you about this very, very interesting episode in Colorado history. And I appreciate all of you guys turning out on a Tuesday night for this. So let's get into it, shall we? All right. All of these headlines are from Colorado newspapers between 1966 and 1967. And yes, I did find some Routt County specific ones there. Don't ask me too much in detail about them. This might be a future talk I need to give. During the 1960s, massive, massive wave across the country of UFO, hysteria is not quite the word for it, but interest in UFOs, and Colorado was no exception. And part of the reason for that is that from 1966 to 1968, Colorado was the absolute epicenter of UFO research in the United States, all centered at the University of Colorado, now the University of Colorado Boulder. And it all centered around one guy, this guy, Edward Euler Condon, and I'm going to walk you through his story today. He is the guy who headed the major research study at CU Boulder, now known as the Condon Committee, named after him. And he definitely looks like the kind of guy who would head a UFO research study. I've actually heard recordings of this guy speaking. I'll tell you a little bit about that later, but let's just say, not the most likely candidate. So why am I here today telling you about this? It's because the collection that I manage at CU Boulder, we have part of Edward Condon's papers. We have 38 boxes of his research material related to the Condon Committee's work to research whether UFOs exist. And I say part of because the other half of his papers are at the American Philosophical Society on the East Coast. And since I arrived at CU in 2018, this has been a collection that has absolutely fascinated me. And as we'll get into it later with the recent interest in UFO activity at the federal level and in the public, we've been getting a lot of research interest in them. So when Candace asked me if I'd give a talk on something controversial and interesting, I said, I've got the talk for you. So let's back up to Edward Condon, because I gotta walk you through how this guy ends up at CU leading this study. We'll skip over some of his early backstory, but he really starts to come to prominence in 1928. He has a job at Princeton. He's a nuclear physicist. After that, he becomes the director of research for Westinghouse Electric Company, where, as you may or may not know, Westinghouse was involved in a lot of research related to military activity and nuclear activity. And so he led up their research department, and a lot of his research dealt with nuclear energy, microwave radar technology. And then during World War II, he starts to act as a consultant on nuclear projects involving national defense, which is how he ends up working for the Manhattan Project. No, that is not Edward Condon. That is the actor who played him in Oppenheimer. And it's really fantastic that he's actually in it, however briefly, because he was only on the Manhattan Project for 6 weeks before he resigned. And this is really crucial, so pay attention, because this informs everything that happens later to him. The reason that he resigned is that he didn't quite believe in national security. This is a guy who'd been at Princeton and at Westinghouse, who was used to collaborating with academics and scientists at other universities, and also academics and scientists in other international places like Russia. So he comes to Los Alamos, he starts working, and immediately he starts getting into it with General Leslie Groves, who was the project's military director. And he said, I don't get this. Like, why is this such a matter of national security? I should be able to talk to people around the country and the world about the research that's being done here. And Groves said, are you kidding me? No. So he left, and that disagreement with Groves did not end. In fact, 2 years later, Condon gets an invite to the 220th anniversary of the founding of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Yeah. And guess who has something to say about that? Yeah. So Groves contacted Westinghouse, where Condon went back to work, and said, no way is this going to happen. And he basically forbade Westinghouse to allow Condon to attend. And he said, you know, the major concern is that Condon's going to share this atomic research with the Russians. Now I'm going to say right here, Condon throughout his whole entire life swore up and down that he never did any such thing. And as you'll see, he got asked a lot. And so all of this ends up in Groves revoking Condon's passport. And I want you to keep this in mind, as I said before, because this has a lot of bearing on what happens later. So Condon goes on to become the director of what was then the Bureau of National Standards, now the National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST. Some of you may know what they do, I do not. Under Truman. And it's here where his career takes a very, very significant turn. One that likely ends up resulting in his engagement with UFO research. I swear it all comes back to UFO research, bear with me. So from 1948 to 1952, Condon was one of the most prominent scientists in the country targeted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, who, as some of you might know, that was the committee charged with seeking out people disloyal to the US government, communists under the McCarthy era, Senator McCarthy. And this committee repeatedly accuses him of being one of the greatest threats to national security, which, as I've said before, Condon vehemently denies. So here's just a little brief timeline of what happens. So this actually starts a couple years before, 1948 and 1946, when J. Edgar Hoover names Condon, he writes a letter to President Truman and names Condon and several other government agents of colluding with the Russians, probably based on Groves's earlier accusations. And in that letter, he calls Condon nothing more or less than an espionage agent in disguise. 1 year later, and literally 1 year later, almost to the day, all these things keep happening in March of each year. March 1947, Congressman J. Parnell Thomas, who was heading up the House Un-American Activities Committee, publishes a letter in the Washington Post where he again accuses Condon of disloyalty to the United States. This gets followed by an actual accusation by the House Un-American Activities Committee, which names Condon as, quote, one of the weakest links in national security. And this goes on and on and on until September 1952, when Condon finally testifies in front of the committee. I said it goes on and on until 1952. It actually continues. So that, as a result of that testimony, the committee concludes that Condon is unsuitable for security clearance. And what you need to know is during this, as this is all going on, Condon has left Westinghouse, and he's now working for Corning Glass Works, which, similar to Westinghouse, had contracts with the federal government for defense. So he was doing the same thing there. He was applying his interest in nuclear physics to that defense work that Corning was done. So when the committee declares that he's unfit for security clearance, he is eventually cleared, but then he has it revoked again in July of 1954. Nixon pulls that same old card that Groves first pulled out in 1945 and said, we're not going to allow this guy to have national security clearance. So later that year, Condon decides, this is it, I'm done. I am not going to try to do federal military research anymore. I am going to go back to teaching. And as he put it, I am unwilling to continue a potentially indefinite series of reviews and re-reviews. And you got to think that there's something to that, because he had to have been feeling really battered almost 10 years later. All right, so This is where it all goes back to the Condon Committee. Oh, and here are just a couple headlines that I pulled out. These are all Colorado newspapers, by the way, with some AP and UP reports. It's hard to understand today just how much Condon's name was in the news during this time. As one of the top scientists, and sometimes the top scientist accused of being disloyal to the federal government, his name was a household name at one point in time. And so reputationally, this is incredibly damaging to him. So he goes back to teaching, as I said. He teaches here and there, ends up at Washington University for a couple years, and then in 1963, ends up at the University of Colorado. And this is one of the photos from our collections in the archives there. So how did this guy, a nuclear physicist who navigated so much public turmoil about his supposed disloyalty to the country and considered a national security risk, how did he end up leading the nation's first ever public, that's a really key word, public, federally funded research into the existence of UFOs? So we gotta back up one more time, because we gotta understand the lay of the land in 1963 to 66 when he arrives at CU in terms of UFO research. And I'm gonna say, as an archivist, I know a little about a lot. I am not an expert, and there may be people in the room who know far more than me, and that is okay. You can come up and tell me later what I've gotten wrong. So prior to all of this, the US Air Force had been more or less clandestinely conducting UFO research since 1948. There are 3 different projects. The first one, Project Sign, happened in 1948, very short-lived, and I'll tell you why in a second. The goal of the project was to collect, evaluate, distribute government information relating to UFO sightings. This was supposed to be distributed publicly, and on the premise that they might pose a national security concern. Well, very quickly, and this is why Project Sign gets shut down and Project Grudge begins, very quickly, the military realized that sending out all of this UFO research into the general public is likely going to cause mass hysteria, which is also a national security risk because it could be leveraged by another government. And I say that it's sort of continued until 1999 because we've learned relatively recently that though the Air Force said they shut down Project Red in 1949, it actually did continue at a classified level until 1999. Project Blue Book. So let me tell you first what the results of Project Grudge are. Though it's intended to alleviate public anxiety over UFOs and kind of persuade the public that UFOs are nothing unusual, nothing to be worried about, it got roundly criticized as a public relations campaign. So it gets shut down. And in 1949, the Air Force starts a third project, Project Blue Book. Now, Project Blue Book is now very narrowly focused on determining whether UFOs are actually a threat to national security and to, quote, scientifically analyze all of this UFO data. Why the Air Force? Because a lot of the sightings that were happening with Air Force pilots and were also happening in US airspace. So that's the reason for the Air Force doing this. And as this is all going on, members of the government are getting increasingly concerned about why the federal dollars are being spent on this research. And members of the public are beginning to voice criticism that this might actually just be a cover-up. And that also scientists are publishing articles left and right saying the Air Force is conducting really shoddy research. This is not scientific. So this leads to the middle picture here, which you cannot see very well, I apologize for that. That is the special report of the US Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board on Project Blue Book. So in April 1966, the Air Force convenes this task force basically to examine whether the Air Force should continue working on this research. And their recommendation, after you flip through lots and lots of pages, is that, and sorry, that was February 1966 that happens. They recommend that this should be a scientific research project at an actual university with actual respected scientists. Do you think Condon's out there like, me? And then a few months later, on the right there, the Congress holds a hearing on unidentified flying objects. So that's the April 1966 one. And surprise, shock, they come to the same conclusion. So then they start putting out feelers, and no one says yes. Except for Condon. Why did he do this? So there's been a lot of speculation because he was very, very clear publicly through everything from the time he accepted this until his death in 1974. He said, I did this out of public service. But in talking with friends and family members, some of his biographers say, no. He did this to get back in the good graces of the federal government after everything that he'd been there so that he could again start to receive federal contracts. So automatically, this guy may or may not have an ulterior motive for doing this work. So he establishes what becomes the Condon Committee. And their agenda was all of these things. They were going to review all of those Air Force reports that I've mentioned before, review all of the photographic and film evidence that the Air Force had collected, even better because we have all of this stuff. They were going to review all of the scientific, that should say scientific and popular literature and reports. And the popular literature takes up a massive part of this collection that we have, and it is pretty fantastic, and you'll see some of it in a bit. They're going to go out and conduct interviews, go back to talk to the people who had reported these sightings to the Air Force. They're going to go back out and talk to them. And then analyze all of this data and speak with other scientists about possible other scientific explanations. It was supposed to only be a year, and it quickly balloons into 2 years. Frankly, I'm amazed that it took them just 2 years. So the Condon collection at CU Boulder contains all of that research material. Almost all of those 38 boxes are the research material that Condon amassed during his time heading up the committee. And the committee included a member of the university as a coordinator. There were astronomers. There were psychologists, chemists, electrical engineers. And so this was, he was trying to get the widest variety of expertise on this project. And so they start sifting through all of this stuff. And we have this. This is the Project Grudge final report. As you can see, it says it's been unclassified. Copies are available publicly now, but when we received this collection in 1971, this was really rare material. And in fact, we have letters from Condon disallowing some of his critics access to the collection. Oh, he was a firecracker. Just as just offhand for a second. So at the same time this is all going on, he also decides that he wants to run for regent of the University of Colorado, which at that time you could be a faculty member and run, just no one had ever done it before. And his opponent was the Republican Joe Coors, who, as many of you know, was very, very conservative. And yes, we have him on record in a public meeting calling Joe Coors a scoundrel and a devil. That gives you a sense for just the kind of guy that Condon was. By all reports, he was cantankerous, he was upfront, he was in your face.
Sounds like somebody.
Did he lose?
He did lose, yes. The regents eventually said, no, you cannot be a faculty member and be a regent at the same time. So they start sifting through all of this stuff. So they start sifting through the Project Grudge reports. I wish you could read these. I'll just read out a little. So the Project Grudge reports include a lot of case studies and incidents. I pulled out two. One on the left is from Hannibal, Minnesota, where 2 children, ages 8 and 10, described a dull gray object 2 feet in diameter and 1 foot thick, shaped like 2 plates together, which settled gently to the ground. Doesn't that sound nice? It clanked when it touched down. On the ground, it emitted a whistling noise and shot up to 20 feet where it hesitated, whistled once more, shot up to 30 feet, then shot off in a northeast direction. And the Air Force's opinion, written below, is This apparent bit of fantasy is hardly worth further consideration. The one on the right, from Smoke River Canyon, Idaho, a farmer with his 2 sons, ages 10 and 8, witnessed an object move down a canyon. It was in view momentarily at a distance of 300 feet, blah, blah, blah. The farmer doubted the possibility of its visibility if viewed against the sky. And the object passed over some trees, which in the words of the farmer, spun around on top as if they were in a vacuum. Air Force opinion: it seems logical to concur that this object was simply a rapidly moving atmospheric eddy. Remember the whole point of Project Grudge, which is to disprove everything that Project Sign was putting out into the world. Then they start going through Project Blue Book. So here's a technical report that we have in our collections, which has a lot of data. There's so much data, qualitative and quantitative, in this collection. And one of the things I love best about the Project Blue Book reports are these case drawings of the actual unidentified flying objects that people saw. In this case, this is a sighting on 1948 when a pilot and a co-pilot were flying. When they saw an object coming towards them, it passed to the right, and this is the one on the left I'm talking about. Went into a steep climb, was lost from sight in some clouds. Seemed powered by jet or rocket motors, and that is the artist's rendering of what that must have looked like. And then there were other Air Force reports they compiled. There's a lot of extraneous information that the federal government collected that is not in the final Air Force report, so they were collecting those. They were also reviewing photo and film evidence. And so these are a couple of the photos that were published in the final report. The one on the bottom here is, the report doesn't say where this was, but I believe it was California, and they determined that it was physically fabricated. The one in the middle is from McMinnville, Oregon in June of 1967. Had no explanation for that. The final one on the right was taken by an Army private at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, also in 1967. No conclusion on that either. And I really, really, really wanted to bring you a film that's in the collection, but I could not get it to play right. It's a film taken at Vandenberg Air Force Base as the project was going on, of a rocket launch that apparently a UFO was caught on film, and we do have that in the collection. So I'm very sad that I couldn't bring that today. So they're reviewing all this stuff, and at the same time they're reviewing scientific literature. So I don't know if you can see on the left who the author is, and anybody who's close up can see. Carl Sagan. Yep, exactly. Yep. And thousands and thousands of other pieces, other scientific research that have been done on other possible explanations for UFOs, on whether UFOs were physically possible at all. They're combing through everything. And then they're combing through some of that popular literature. So here are two that I pulled out. The UFO Researcher is the one on the left here. This was an issue from March of 1967. And it says the UFO Research Organization is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the collection and dissemination of evidence and data relating to the UFOs on a local and worldwide basis. And then on the other side, we've got UFO Contact, the IGAP Journal, the Journal of the International Get Acquainted Program, which was dedicated to setting the stage for the human and alien life force interaction. So they were going through everything that they could find. And then the next step was to analyze all of this data. So this is one of the really interesting things that we have in Condon's archive. On the left here, again, I wish that you could see this more clearly. That is a handwritten log of all of the sightings that they were going to review. And you can go through here, and the ones that you can kind of barely see are marked in red. One says, oh, let's see if my 46-year-old eyes can actually read this. Here's one that happened at an Air Force base. And it's noting the reference where it was, the longitude and latitude, the date, the time. On the right side, this is actually from the final published report. It's a comparison of reports in terms of their different characteristics. So noting the time, again, the size, the shape, the color, the formation of the object. So they're trying to do this. They're trying to counter that criticism of the Air Force research that it was not scientific enough. And the final report has wonderful, wonderful drawings in it of some of these sightings. And I wish that I had written down which case this was from, but I just think that these diagrams are really wonderful. As well as trajectories, too. This one, I believe, relates to the Vandenberg Air Force sighting, showing the trajectory on the left taking off, as well as its glide path, where the radar was in relationship to it. This is incredibly detailed. And yes, there were Colorado cases that they were looking at. So I just brought this one up because there were a lot of, they tried to rule out the ones that really were not, had a scientific, there was a scientific explanation for them. And this one caught, this caught local attention in some of the papers. There was a horse named Snippy who was found drained of blood outside of Alamosa in 1967. And of course, and we'll get to this in a second because I'm going to show you just how crazy people were knowing that this was happening in Colorado. Of course, this causes a huge hysteria. Oh my gosh, it's UFOs, they've drained his blood, it must have been. And this is the follow-up article saying, Colorado horse death ruled no UFO case. They determined that the horse had died by an infection that had abscessed, and then someone had come along and out of the kindness of their heart apparently slit the horse's throat and the blood drained out. Yeah, sorry. A little gruesome. So all told, they ended up focusing on 59 cases, and I pulled out 2 of my favorite ones from Colorado specifically. So what's really interesting about this, and again, I don't know if you can see it very clearly, this is not from the Condon collection at CU. This is from the other half of his papers at the American Philosophical Society. That half of the papers has all of his personal research and a lot of the information that he did not want to make public at CU. People knew that this research was happening at CU. Immediately after the project concluded and he gave the papers to the archives, people were banging on the door, wanting to see the work that he'd done. He took a lot of that research, about 40 boxes worth, and placed it in as far away as he could get in Pennsylvania. And this is one of them. And what I love about this one is that this is case 17, which took place in Red Vale, Colorado. We only know that because we have access to this original document, because as you'll see in the published report, they took out all identifying information about where things occurred and who witnessed it. In this case, a high schooler reported that he'd been in his car when a UFO appeared, that it paced him for about 30 miles and caused electromagnetic interference with the car. And this happened in April 1967. So this was happening this was recorded by them as the study is going on. So they're not just going back through that past material, they're also collecting the information. Now, what's really interesting about looking at this document is, do you see how it's all marked up? Just how heavily edited all of these original case sightings were, because this is what it looks like when you get to case 17 in the published report. It's identified as South Mountain, which just means the South Rocky Mountain area. And all identifying information is taken out of there. It is a little bit easier to read. So he was an 18-year-old high school boy returning from a first aid class in town to his parents' home, a general store. Reported that shortly after 11 p.m., when he was 3 miles west of town, he noticed an object high in the sky directly ahead of him. Compared it to an incandescent light bulb seen at 20 feet or a slow-moving ball of fire. And as I said, he reports that it moves past him. Interesting thing about this case is that they have no conclusion to what it possibly could be, no scientific explanation for it. Another one that was also South Mountain, and we know from other writings about Condon that this was likely in the Denver area. This is also in 1967, 2 air traffic controllers, possibly at Stapleton, it's not identified, reported that an unauthorized aircraft or a radar anomaly followed another aircraft into the airport's airspace. And this goes through, again, this really shows their process. They would go down and they would investigate the witnesses in person. They would ask them questions. They would consult with scientific experts to try to see if there was any other conclusion. They would get to know the witnesses' families to see if there was anything that would discredit them. And then they published them. So as I said, there were 59 studies. So as this is going on, as they're combing through all of this, this is not private. Everyone knows this is happening. And it's being covered in the popular press. This is Look magazine, and their issue, Scientific Fact or Science Fiction, you'll have to decide for yourself. And it's talking about the beginning of the project. In 1967, this starts another wave of UFO interest across the country. This is a program from New York's first flying saucer convention in 1967, June 23rd to 25th, 1967, with I'll just read some of the talks. Have extraterrestrials really landed? Why do flying saucers kidnap dogs? What happens to the 20,000 people who each year disappear from New York City alone? Read the story of the man who built and flew flying saucer models, and how flying saucers caused our massive blackouts. This is hard-hitting stuff. And in Colorado, these are a few headlines from Colorado newspapers, just to show you just how engaged the public was with this story. There was all sorts of interest, and this memo on the left, this is written by, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember his first name. This is one of the researchers on the study taking a memo for Condon, and it's from an amateur radio nut, I believe is the word that's on there, chiming in to say, oh no, so as a publisher of the magazine, phone me before this issue. I see, okay, let me back up for a second. This is from a amateur radio magazine, not a nut, sorry guy, whoever you are. So the publisher of this magazine phoned me before this issue was published, telling of his plans to set up a UFO reporting network as described on page 4. Mr. Green was asked to keep us informed of the progress in setting up the network. He wondered if his network could help, but was informed of the short remaining lifetime of this project. People were actively calling in to Condon to say, how can I help? How can I be a part of this? And this is just one example of this. And at the same time at CU, of course, the university students are getting in on this. This is one of my favorite things. So April 1967, 3 students launched 3 hot air balloons made of reddish and orange plastic bags and candles, and set them to fly over Flagstaff Mountain. If any of you know Boulder, that's right next to the Flatirons, and sparked a number of alleged UFO sightings. And Condon's committee had to chime in very, very quickly and debunk these, and of course the students admitted that yes, it was all a hoax. So now you can just see how engaged the public was with all of this research, and the center that Colorado had for this work. So the conclusions. In 1968, the committee concludes its research, and they publish 2 things. They publish on the left 3 volumes filled with research. So this is about 1,000 pages of their research, detailing those case studies and analyses that they had done. The chapters include field studies, research on electromagnetic effects that could cause this, visual and radar images. There's observations from astronauts in addition to the on-the-ground witnesses. This is really, these are heavy volumes. And then on the right, the New York Times also publishes a abridged paperback version of this, which is available in the public press. So again, this is not a report, not activities are happening in a vacuum. This is widespread nationwide. And their conclusions start with this. Nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to the scientific record. Now remember, the whole reason this committee exists is to tell the federal government whether the Air Force should continue the research they've been doing. Further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectation that science will be advanced today. Wait, hang on. But they also say, we believe that any scientist with adequate training and credentials who does come up with a clearly defined scientific proposal for study should be supported. In other words, not the Air Force. Oh, and don't forget, this is a point that Condon likes to bring up again and again. Children are going to be harmed by this. So he says, we feel that children are educationally harmed by absorbing unsound and erroneous material. Such study retards the development of a critical faculty with regard to scientific evidence. And he goes on to even say a teacher should not be given credit for any sort of study of UFO activity in the schools. 1968. So as the study concludes in October of 1968, all this time, I bet some of you are wondering, how did the university feel about this? Well, they felt it was a little awkward for them. And if you go back through our university records, see Boulder, my archives holds the university records from the president's office and other administrative offices that relate to this period of time. What you can see is the university continuing to have to justify why they're actually doing this. And one of the internal justifications they made to themselves is, well, the money they gave us to do this research really isn't that much. It was about $313,000. $313,000, that's right. So I guess it's a small amount of money. It's not gonna hurt anybody if we do this. And externally, when the project's over, they find that they really have to justify it. So this is a letter from then President of CU, Joseph R. Smiley, to the Air Force, saying this has been very scientific, and there is no question that any of the matters reported in this document reflect anything other than the strictest attention to the discovery and disclosure of the facts. And then he goes on to say, we hope and believe that it will have the effect of placing the controversy as to the nature of unidentified flying objects in a proper scientific perspective, and that it might stimulate more research. So again, justifying it, the university is standing behind Condon, but we actually know behind closed doors that Condon was getting a lot of questions about why he was doing this. So what's the aftermath? What happens next? Report comes out, published widely, available widely. Well, it's mixed. Surprise! So some people received it very positively. There was a op-ed in Science magazine that said, unquestionably, it was the most thorough and sophisticated investigation of the nebulous UFO phenomenon ever conducted. But then other scientists were rather confused about why this happened to begin with. In Nature, in March 1969, Nature called it a monumental achievement, but misapplied ingenuity. Like, why on earth would Condon, one of our most respected scientists who's endured so much, lead this research? And then, on the very far end of the spectrum, outright criticism. So this is a quote from physicist James McDonald, who, by the way, is one of those people who was banging down the doors of the CU Boulder archives immediately after Condon donated his papers to see that research, and Condon was writing letters to the then head of archives saying, nope. And McDonald says, the level of scientific argumentation is wholly unsatisfactory. But this doesn't really matter, does it? Because ultimately, the effect that it has is that the Air Force closes Project Blue Book. The federal government says, we're not going to give you any more money to do this. And so Project Blue Book ends in 1969, effectively, at least until recent knowledge, shutting down the government's interest in UFO research until the early 2000s. But now we know that that's not exactly the case. So Condon concludes the study, 1968, retires in 1970, dead 4 years later. This was the last significant thing that he did. So how did he feel about this legacy? Well, in 1969, he published in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society, remember where his other papers are, UFOs I have loved and lost. And I pulled out a couple quotes that I really appreciate from this, and that I think really represent how he felt about this, or publicly felt about this. Again, we have no access to any private writings about how in correspondence about what the how he felt behind the scenes about this. So the top quote says, for those of you who can't read in the back, to discover clear, unambiguous evidence of UFOs would be a scientific discovery of the first magnitude, one which I would be quite happy to make. However, as he goes on to say, the committee found no such evidence, and they state that in the report. So he's backing up the claims of the committee, but at the same time he's saying, you know, again, we need detailed scientific research, not from the Air Force, from scientists to continue this. And then this is where true Condon comes out. I continue to be astonished at the fervor which with many people hold views that are totally unsupported by objective evidence of any kind. Some of the believers are charlatans. Again, did not mince words. And then finally, don't forget the children. In conclusion, let me say, where corruption of children's minds is at stake, I do not believe in freedom of the press or freedom of speech. Yeah, not wishy-washy, that Condon. So he stood behind his work on this project and never publicly made any public claim to distance himself from it. However, it's worth noting that when his official obituary was published by his children after his death, it did not make any reference to his work on the Condon Committee. So what happens next? Well, as we all know, within the last 4 years, there's been a renewed public and scientific interest in what's now called unidentified aerial phenomenon, UAPs, and which seems a lot like rebranding to me. There's been a lot of renewed interest in Condon's work and the committee's work, and going back to that critical mass of case studies and research that they did. And I just point out there's a number of things that have happened over the last couple of years, but I pointed out to a couple of things. One is in 2020, there's a documentary release called The Phenomenon by James Fox that references Condon's extensively. We actually consulted with the director and his team on that aspect of the documentary. 2020, the National Intelligence Report on UAPs is released. That's actually available on their website. 2022, NASA has commissioned an ongoing study of UAPs right now. So there is actually work at the federal government to dive back into all of that research that Condon and his team did in Colorado. So that's all I've got to say about that. I'll leave you with this. One of the things that the Condon Committee did was they also collected a lot of cartoons relating to the UFO experience. And this is one of my favorite ones with this little dude, this little alien in his little spaceship saying, "Now do you believe it?" I can't answer that question, I'll leave that up to you. But I'm happy to take questions from all of you right now. Oh boy. Yes, go ahead.
Were there times in our recent history or in the 20th century when there were more sightings than others? Were there more sightings in the 60s, or were there just more attention?
So that's a great question, and I'll speak about it as much as I can without having kind of prior knowledge to this era that I've talked about. So from 1944 to 1968, that was a massive wave of UFO sightings in the country. Some people tie that into World War II and again, national security. Just UFOs being more in the popular consciousness because of that. And then, as I've said, all of this public comment about the Air Force's work and also the committee's publicity. And then that really tails off after that time. So you have about this 24, 25 year window. That said, there have been periods in the 19th century and earlier where there have been also rashes of that as well, tied in with religious phenomena.
I claim to have seen a UFO in 1969, so that's
Amazing.
why.
I want to hear more about that. It's amazing when I started working on this research years ago, how many people will come and say, I've seen one, and I love hearing these stories. Yeah?
To your knowledge of the analysis, did they find any like similarities in different areas or things that just stood out?
Yeah, so I think where they figured they could scientifically disprove that they were UFOs, they were relating them to, again, electromagnetic phenomena in the sky, atmospheric phenomena, meteorological phenomena, clouds, honestly. But there's what's really interesting about this report, despite its conclusion, is how many case studies say we can't explain this. And so that's where a lot of the criticism came in is, okay, this is supposed to be a scientific study, and yet you've got all these cases where the official conclusion on the case study is we can't explain what happened here. Yeah.
Down by, in southern Colorado, down by the sand dunes, there's actual, they call them the alien outpost.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be the most sighted UFOs in Colorado.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
know anything about that?
No, I was part of a local news piece where they interviewed the woman who runs that, but I don't know very much about that. I do know that it's really interesting in this report. You definitely see some southern Colorado activity, but there's a lot happening on the western slope too. And then you saw those headlines. I really hope you did not miss the Hans Peak and Routt County sightings from October of 1967. So the reports are coming from all over the state, but I don't know much about that. Yeah.
In the study, did he do any comparisons between what the current view of propulsion gives in relationship to what they see? Because I noticed on the earlier ones, they showed looking like rockets, and on the later ones, we're using the newer possibilities of propulsion.
Yeah, and so what's interesting, so for those of you who couldn't hear in the back, he's asking about the study of propulsion in this and how changing science relating to that. What's really interesting is that when Condon was at CU, he was affiliated with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So he was intimately familiar with that research, and you can see it being really folded in. I'm not a scientist, so I do not understand what's being talked about, but they're getting into some of those earlier drawings that you saw from the Air Force didn't even talk about, they were just making up numbers about propulsion. They didn't know, they were just trying to estimate based on a jet plane. But you can see Condon actually applying his own research on jet propulsion to the study, the published study.
I was thinking more of psychological. The people, as we progress in our views of propulsion, we imagine things differently.
Yeah, and that's like, as I said, they were psychologists on the team who were actively looking at that. Also remember, it's 1966 to 1968, and CU. Did anybody go to Boulder? All right. Do you want to speak to what the culture was like then? I can tell you because one of our other areas of collecting, we collect Rocky Mountain counterculture and social change, and CU was the epicenter of the drug culture as well, and Timothy Leary was speaking there, and the Dead were coming to play there, so that definitely came into play in the report as well. Yeah, in the back.
You know, I know you were a story
So much.
Yeah.
Air Force intelligence officer David Grush.
Yeah.
Is that like being talked about in your field at all, or do you know anything about his like kind of whistleblowing on like federal cover-ups, but some what seems to be in his mouth, like detail?
Yeah, so you're asking about some of the more recent stuff. So it's really interesting. I can't make the correlation myself, but I have been told that a number of those case studies and witness reports, as I mentioned, were from military officers themselves, and whose anonymity was protected in the report. But I have been told that those who are still alive are now stepping forward and now commenting on exactly what you can see in the editorial marks, in the cutting out of details, that so much was not made public, and that they're now commenting on that. So on that man in particular, I don't know, but I know some of the Vandenberg Air Force pilots have come out to start talking about that, and I believe that's covered in actually James Fox's documentary. In James Fox's documentary, The Phenomenon, he talks about that a lot. Yeah.
I think one of the most important ones that people talk about is in New Mexico, Roswell, New Mexico. And it was like after the war, like maybe 53 or something. And people say that that was really a big cover-up. And this guy was there. He was 4, because his dad was doing dental work in Roswell, New Mexico. And when I asked him about it, he said, that's the stupidest thing. There was nothing. I was there every day. I didn't see a thing. I think the whole thing's crazy. But that's the biggest. That's he didn't see anything, I guess, because he never told. But that's always been like the biggest thing that felt like a cover-up.
And that's where those accusations, I should have made that connection. That's where a lot of those accusations start coming from about Project Blue Book, and the fact that the accusations that the Air Force is covering something up is that there's all that public or media articles and media attention about that, and people are coming forward to speak. That's when a lot of these UFO research societies and groups start to form. We actually, it's really interesting, because we have Condon's papers, we've attracted a number of other donors who experienced unexplained phenomenon, including what they call alien abduction or UFOs. And so we're starting to amass this really interesting critical body of archives. I said to one of my staff, should we have a new collecting area in paranormal activity? Because this is, but Roswell, that connection you see in the through line for all of these papers is that is, you're asking like, what are the big periods? You're absolutely right. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a major thing that elevates all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm guessing from the fact that Condon retired a couple years after the study that the sponsor wasn't a huge fan and maybe didn't give him a lot of juicy federal contracts after that.
Correct.
I'm curious if you could comment on what sort of the federal reception of this was. I mean, that may not be in the archives.
No, that's a great question. So the federal reception of this report is uniformly positive. Mostly because of the internal criticism from members of Congress about the Air Force spending the money. And I don't have the dollar amount for what the Air Force was spending, but it was considerable. And so, some say that Condon took this with the understanding, and I will say that I have seen nothing to back this up. Other scholars may find this eventually. Some people say he took the contract specifically under direction from the federal government to say this is not worth studying and that there's nothing to this. So that's where in recent years, the last 4 years in particular, people are going back to all of that body of work to try to redo this study and work through this again to see what they can find and relate to present day phenomena. Yeah, in the back.
So did you find any of your research, any associations with the amount of, let's say, activity that's happening in the western part of the United States in terms of Air Force and nuclear fission and all sorts of stuff, to the activity of observations?
So it's really interesting asking about where the activity was happening. So they basically broke the U.S. up into it's either 4 or 6 quadrants, like there are 4 or 6 sections. I can't remember off the top of my head. And they tried to make sure that it was geographically diverse. So the case studies are from all over the United States. That said, I think anecdotally, when you look at the media reports during this time, they're all saying there are more sightings here than anywhere else, meaning the Rocky Mountain West. And I assume they would include New Mexico in that as well. Whether that's accurate, I don't, there are only 59 cases in that report out of thousands and thousands of cases that the Condon Committee was combing through. And so I don't think we have enough of a sample to know whether there were sightings specifically happening more in one region than another, because they were really trying to get this geographic diversity.
Were any other countries examining UFOs at the same time?
Of course you're going to ask me that question, Marty. I don't know. That's a really good question. And maybe somebody in the audience can tell me that. I just know that this is the U.S.'s focus during the 60s.
It's kind of odd that
Yeah.
the United States was the designated place for all the scientific.
Hey, those Russians, got to get ahead of the Russians. It's literally the space race. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is that, can you comment on anything you know about the theory that some people say we've seen more UFO activity between the 40s to the 60s when there was more advancements in research in nuclear power here in the States?
Yeah, and that's something that actually gets touched on a little bit in the report too. But it's interesting. I've read a number of things. I don't feel qualified to make a judgment call either way. But I think a lot of it relates to the Red Scare and to the fear of the Soviet Union and people physically watching the skies more than they were prior to World War II. But then also this fear that anything coming into the airspace could be a threat. And so that's what I've read is kind of like the psychological reason why more sightings were occurring between 1945 and the 1960s. It's really interesting that, as far as I've read, it doesn't really continue through the 80s and the end of the Cold War. But you've got that kind of 20-year period of as you can see, one of the Air Force's reasons for kind of switching gears so many times is to counteract that hysteria about what might be in our airspace. I think I can take one more question. Anybody has one? Yes.
Just north of Alamosa, there's a place, you mentioned the young man who got abducted or something. There is actually a place where you go to the landing zone, where you have set aside a place where you go camp and wait for the aliens to come to the
Yeah, and yes, you're the second person who's brought that up. I've got to go down there now.
The second question, I'm just talking to our gentleman back here.
Yeah.
Is, in all of the universe, who believes that we are the only species, or are we alone?
Yeah, and I mean that's ultimately Carl Sagan is part of this study, and he is one of the first people to really say there's no possible way that we can be alone. So people always ask me, this might be a good way for me to wrap up. People always ask me, well, what do you believe? And I think why not believe in this? Isn't there something beautiful in thinking that there's something beyond us? Again, I'm not an expert, but I find this all very fascinating, and I find the fact that it was part of a federal study that happened in Colorado to be most fascinating. You're welcome to reach out to me at my email address if you've got any questions, or come up and talk to me later. And thank you guys all for being so attentive.